Hey Tony. Okay, I want to address a couple of issues. One issue would be shock value versus art, as I think you described it, and well, art and or the public good. And the other the other issue would be how advertisers address our human dispositions to get their point across. So, starting with your image, now, as you stated in your paper, this could have been arranged a totally different way, and we wouldn't interpret it as anything sexual. So, yeah, maybe I should quote you a little bit here. Let me take a look at your paper. Okay, yeah, yeah. You say if the veggies had been arranged in any other configuration, this could have been an ad for our local farmers market. Well, okay, yeah, you're right, absolutely. Um, Now, there is a cultural context to this. If in our American society, this would be more shock value to get our attention. In French Canadian society, it's probably more on the side of art. So there is a cultural context to this. But yeah, the portraiture is very classic, as you had stated. It's brightly lit, dark background. I can even see the reflections of the umbrellas here and the peppers. Uh, no rule of thirds BS going on here. Everything's just dead center, very symmetrical. Center, left, right, center. Okay, so everything's very classic. It's the arrangement and the composition that's the coup de grace, so to speak. Okay, so um, we address here the issue of the restaurant guide, and kind of it's an advertisement for the restaurant guide. Now, moving on to the old ad, Russell Lee uses some degree of shock value, even though back in the time of the FSA, um, breastfeeding wasn't didn't have such a social stigma. But nonetheless, the photographer wanted to draw attention to experiential vignette from the lifestyle of the displaced sharecroppers during this very bad time in American history. So he's simulating breastfeeding because I don't think we even see a breast here. There's no breast happening here. So there is that. Man, do I have my pointer or not? I just can't tell. Okay, but that's okay. I'm going to move on. If my pointer's not working, forgive me, please. All right, so moving on. Now here a we have a woman with her canned food, so to speak, jarred, pickled food. Now this is less shock value and more about environmental portraiture and a smile. So the photographer Jean Vachon is getting his point across through more subtle means. And this ad is this photograph is kind of connected to your contemporary ad, although the cultural context and the timeline is different. Our concern, well, the French Canadian concern in this case is a decent restaurant, and here it's just a question of survival and getting through the lean times. But the intent is kind of the same. I mean, it's similar. Restaurants are not essential to our existence, but it's still tied in with food. And in the cultural context of contemporary French Canadians, and to some degree Americans, I mean, there is a love for restaurants and a concern for the right place to eat, for a good place to eat. Now, as far as our visual predispositions are concerned, I want to show you a couple of optical illusions to show you what I mean. Here we have the power of shape. It's a demonstration of how shape um, can form how our brain sees things. There's no visual perspective here, but the only thing that's happening, these dots are getting skinnier as we go from right to left, and our brains are very happy to assume that this is a third dimension, that we're having that linear perspective is happening here. But there is no third dimension. But we are assuming, looking at this, that there's a third dimension. But shape is only making us assume that, the power of shape. The next one shows us the power of tonality. From our experience, we know that light comes from above. That's where the sun is hanging out. So if the light comes from above and it's hitting the square here, well, then it must not be a square. It must be a protruding shell coming out towards us. But Also, since the light is coming from above, this must be concave because it's hitting the bottom of this concavity. See? But these are just squares. So our brains, again, are all too happy to assume that these are protruding toward this squares. First, third, and fifth squares are really humps protruding towards us, and the second, fourth, and sixth squares are really concavities, caves, protruding away from us. Or protruding might not be the right word, but veering away from us. They're hollowed out because the light's hitting the bottom. It's coming from above. It's hitting the bottom, not the top. So, it's upbringing to some degree. Maybe there is some genetic predisposition in this case, but it's interesting, isn't it? So, again, going back to shock value versus art, I want to address what you about your issue, the AIDS issue, an HIV positive versus an HIV negative part of a partnership. You didn't really address the visual component that strongly, and I guess the rhetorical question I need to ask you here is, how much shock value would you introduce there? Or maybe sometimes shock value is needed. For example, there's a story, the old Muslim story of the imam somewhere in Central Asia who encounters a poor farmer or merchant trying to get his goods to market. He had a mule overloaded with his goods at the side of the road. The mule refused to go any further. Maybe the mule was tired. Maybe the mule was just being stubborn. And the merchant was at his wit's end because he had been there for hours. And the imam comes along. He's walking down the road. I guess he might be going towards the same town as the merchant. And he says, "What's the problem?" And the merchant says, "Imam, I've been trying to reason with this mule. I've tried pushing him. I've tried pulling him. I've tried cajoling him. Nothing works." The imam grabs a huge stick and whacks the donkey across the butt. The donkey rears up and starts sauntering as fast as he can down the road. And the imam turns to the guy and says, "Well, first you got to get his attention." So I guess, sometimes you need shock value. Okay, Tony, I'm going to end it here. I've kind of carried on for too long already. Good job, and I will talk to you again next assignment. Take care.